It all started so innocently. One night, while sitting alone in the kitchen after my husband and kids had gone to bed, I noticed a message pop up on my phone from an unknown number. The message simply said, "You looked beautiful today." Just 4 simple words, yet they sent a little shiver down my spine. I stared at the message for a long time, wondering if it was meant for someone else, or if maybe I'd been added to some prank list. The next morning, I woke up to a second message. "The way you laughed with your friends today, you have no idea how radiant you looked." For a moment, I was confused. Yesterday, I had indeed met some friends for lunch, something I didn't do often but really enjoyed. Had someone seen me? Or was this really just a coincidence? I dismissed it, told myself it was nothing, probably someone bored, and texting random numbers. I didn't reply, but part of me was a little flattered. I was 36, a mother of 2, happily married for almost 10 years, and it had been a while since I'd felt noticed like this. For a moment, I tucked that tiny thrill into a hidden part of my heart and moved on with my day. But the messages didn't stop. The next few days, they kept coming, sweet, charming compliments sent at random times. "Your smile could light up the room." "You looked like you were deep in thought today." "I wonder what you were thinking about." The words felt personal, but never invasive or crude. And for some reason, I didn't tell my husband. I suppose it felt so harmless, like a little secret that only I knew. But as the days went by, I found myself looking forward to those messages. Then, one night, I received a message that made my heart skip a beat. "I know you're probably wondering who I am. You don't know me, but I've seen you around. You're remarkable." I froze, staring at my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. He'd seen me around? He knew who I was? The rush of emotions that washed over me was dizzying. It was flattering, even exhilarating, but there was a tinge of fear. Yet, I still couldn't bring myself to respond or block the number. I thought about it. I thought about it every night. Eventually, the messages grew more specific. "I noticed that you wear that blue dress when you're feeling confident. It suits you." It was true. I wore that dress when I needed a little extra boost. But how did he know? My cheeks flushed as I read his words, a strange thrill mixing with the unease. Part of me wanted him to stop, yet part of me craved these messages, these small validations from someone who seemed to notice everything about me. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was keeping a secret from my husband, the man I loved, the father of my children. But it was just harmless words, right? There was no harm in reading a few compliments, was there? The texts continued, each one more intimate than the last. "Today, I saw you at the grocery store, looking lost in thought again. I wanted to say hello, but I didn't want to scare you. You're even more beautiful in person." My hands were trembling as I read that one. He'd seen me, close enough to reach out. My mind was swirling with questions. Who was he? Had he been there all along, around me every day without my noticing? Was he someone I knew, a friend, a coworker? Or was he a complete stranger who just happened to fixate on me? I should have told someone. I should have blocked him, should have confessed everything to my husband, and yet I couldn't. The thrill had wrapped itself around me like a warm blanket, giving me a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in years. I kept waiting for the messages. It became part of my routine, checking my phone to see if he'd sent something, as though he'd filled some quiet, invisible void in my life that I hadn't even known existed. And yet, that thrill was mixed with a growing guilt. Every night, lying beside my husband, I'd feel the weight of my own silence pressing down on me. Sometimes I'd wake up at night and look at his sleeping face, feeling like I'd betrayed him even though I hadn't done anything. But still, I couldn't bring myself to stop. It was like being on the edge of a cliff, knowing the danger, but unable to step back. Then came the day I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. A message arrived that said, "I can tell when you're happy. You look a little brighter, a little freer. But I also see when you're sad. You carry it so deeply. I just wish I could take it all away." For a moment, I almost cried. How did he know? It was as though he could see straight through me, peeling away the walls I had so carefully built around myself. I couldn't understand how a stranger could know these things even my husband, in all our years together, hadn't noticed. And that realization unsettled me more than anything else. I started to feel his presence everywhere. At work, at the gym, even just walking through the neighborhood. Every time I passed by a man on the street, I'd wonder, is it him? I became hyper-aware, scanning faces, overanalyzing casual glances, my heart thudding whenever someone looked at me for too long. One night, after tucking the kids into bed, I sat down alone with my phone, my heart racing. I felt like I was on the brink of some terrible decision. I typed a message back, for the first time. My fingers hovered over the screen before I pressed send. "Who are you?" For a few agonizing minutes, there was no reply. I sat in the silence, listening to the ticking of the kitchen clock, my mind racing with possibilities. Finally, the reply came. "Someone who admires you more than you could ever know. But if you want me to leave you alone, I will." I stared at his message, feeling a strange ache in my chest. I didn't want him to stop, and that realization terrified me. This wasn't just harmless anymore. It was something else, something I couldn't explain, a strange line I didn't know I'd crossed until now. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to reply. I deleted his messages one by one, clearing my inbox. And yet, as I sat in the dim light of the kitchen, I knew this wasn't over. Not really. I knew I should let go, move on, pretend it had never happened. But even as I told myself that, a part of me couldn't help but wonder if he would message me again. The days that followed were strangely quiet. I deleted every message and resolved to forget. But the absence of those words, that little thrill that had invaded my life, left an unexpected emptiness. I found myself scrolling through old texts, reading through mundane conversations, hoping to stumble upon something that would pull me back into that same feeling. But nothing was there. The messages had been my guilty secret, a spark of something forbidden that had brightened my days in ways I didn't fully understand. Now, the thrill was gone, and in its place was a nagging sense of loneliness that I couldn't shake. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but it wasn't long before I felt someone watching me again. I'd be sitting at a cafe or browsing at a store and feel that familiar, subtle prickling at the back of my neck. I'd turn, expecting to catch someone's eye, but no one was there. One morning, while waiting at a red light on my drive to work, my phone buzzed. I glanced down and saw an unknown number again. My heart leapt, betraying me. I wanted to ignore it, tell myself it didn't matter, but my fingers betrayed me, tapping to open the message. "You looked a little sad today." I missed seeing that smile. My mouth went dry. This time, I felt something shift, a line I hadn't known I was crossing. The fear was no longer a flicker, but a steady flame that burned alongside the excitement. He had seen me again. Seen me close enough to notice my expression, to gauge my mood, and it unsettled me more deeply than ever. My hand trembled as I typed back, "Who are you really?" The response came back quickly, faster than I expected. "Someone who wants to make you happy. Someone who sees the real you." The words struck something deep within me. There was a vulnerability, a yearning in me that his words seemed to touch. Part of me felt foolish, embarrassed even, for letting his words have such an effect. But another part, perhaps a darker, hidden part, felt exhilarated, more alive than I had felt in years. A few days went by, and I became consumed with thoughts of this stranger. Who could he be? The possibilities circled my mind endlessly. Every man I passed on the street became a suspect in my mind. I began to look for subtle hints, small gestures, anything that might give him away. A friendly smile from a barista felt like a secret sign. The quiet guy from the office who always looked at me a second too long became a mystery I wanted to solve. Then came another message. "I've watched you for so long, just from afar, admiring everything about you. But I think you're beginning to see me now." I didn't know how to respond. My fingers hesitated over the keys, torn between curiosity and caution. This was no longer just a stranger's words. It felt like he was waiting for me to open a door, to let him in. In a moment of weakness, I typed, "Why me?" There was a pause, longer than usual. I waited, anxiety tightening in my chest until my phone buzzed with his answer. Because you deserve more. You deserve someone who sees the small things, who notices the way you laugh, the way you carry your strength and your sadness together. You deserve someone who sees all of you. It was an answer I didn't know I'd been yearning to hear. The words were exactly what I'd always hoped someone would say, what I'd quietly wished my husband might notice after all these years together. A voice in the back of my mind reminded me that I was playing with fire, that every text, every question was pulling me further from the life I knew. But I felt helpless to stop it. The words wrapped around me, drawing me deeper, igniting a longing I hadn't even known existed. One evening, as I lay in bed next to my husband, I couldn't resist anymore. I opened my messages and typed, "I want to know who you are. Please tell me." I held my breath, heart pounding, waiting for his response. Finally, my phone lit up. "Meet me tomorrow. I'll be waiting for you at the little park by the coffee shop. Noon." The message left me breathless, caught between excitement and dread. I knew I shouldn't go. I knew it was madness, a risk I had no business taking. But as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the anticipation that pulsed through me. I had to see him, to end this mystery that had consumed my every thought. The next day, I found myself standing at the edge of the park, my heart hammering in my chest. I had arrived early, scanning the benches, the small playground, the trees. I didn't know who I was looking for, but I couldn't stop imagining what he might look like, a mysterious, handsome stranger with kind eyes who would finally bring clarity to the whirlwind of emotions I'd been feeling. I waited, pacing, glancing at my phone every few minutes, expecting a message. But there was nothing. Noon came and went, and still, no one approached. Just as I began to feel foolish, my phone buzzed. "Look across the park." I froze, then slowly lifted my gaze. Across the lawn, near a cluster of trees, a man stood. He wore a baseball cap and sunglasses, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I could feel his gaze fixed on me. My stomach tightened as I realized he was waiting, watching, inviting me into something I couldn't yet understand. For a long moment, I hesitated, torn between walking over and turning around to leave. But something in his stance, in the quiet way he seemed to acknowledge me without moving, pulled me forward. I took a step, then another, and before I knew it, I was crossing the park, my heart racing with every step. Just as I reached him, he turned, disappearing down a path that wound through the trees. I paused, uncertain, but his message appeared on my phone. "Follow me." Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn back, to run. But the mystery was intoxicating, luring me forward with promises I couldn't quite decipher. I followed him, winding deeper into the trees, until the sounds of the park faded, replaced by the quiet rustling of leaves. Finally, I saw him again, standing near a bench tucked away from the main paths, his face partially hidden in shadow. I wanted to speak, to ask him who he was, why he'd chosen me. But as I opened my mouth, he held up a hand, stopping me. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low and calm, "we need someone to remind us who we are. Someone who sees us in ways we can't see ourselves." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out, fingers brushing against mine. A spark shot through me, an electric charge that left me breathless. In that moment, standing in the dappled sunlight with a stranger who knew more about me than anyone else, I felt more alive than I had in years. But then, just as quickly as he'd appeared, he stepped back. "I'll be around," he said, a faint smile curving his lips. "Whenever you need someone who understands." And with that, he turned, disappearing down the path, leaving me standing alone, my heart pounding, my mind spinning with 1,000 questions I'd never get to ask. I knew I should feel relieved, that I should feel grateful he was gone. But as I walked back to my car, a quiet ache settled deep within me, a longing that would linger for days, maybe even years. And every so often, even now, I still glance at my phone, hoping for one last message from the stranger who'd seen right through me. In the days that followed, the encounter at the park lingered in my mind like a vivid dream. I kept replaying every moment, the sound of his voice, the way he'd seemed to look right through me, as if he knew every hidden piece of my heart. It was haunting, almost addictive. And though he'd left, the mark he'd made on me refused to fade. Every time my phone buzzed, my pulse raced, but the messages didn't come. I would stare at the empty screen, my heart sinking with disappointment I didn't dare acknowledge, even to myself. I had expected, I didn't even know what. A message, an explanation, something to bridge the gap between the fantasy and the reality I'd been swept into. But the silence stretched on, deepening the ache, and I knew I couldn't tell anyone about it. Not my friends, not even the closest ones who knew me almost as well as I knew myself. This was something different, something I wasn't ready to share. Then one evening, about a week after that strange meeting, I found myself sitting alone at the kitchen table, my thoughts drifting to the stranger once again. My husband was working late, and the kids had gone to bed hours ago, leaving the house quiet, still. I poured myself a glass of wine, hoping it would calm the restless feeling that had settled into my bones. But as I took a sip, my phone buzzed. I nearly dropped my glass. There, on the screen, was a familiar number. My heart skipped a beat as I opened the message. "Thinking about you tonight." A warmth spread through me, mingling with a wave of relief and excitement that I couldn't deny, no matter how hard I tried. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete the message and pretend I hadn't seen it. But another part, the part that had been quietly craving this, knew I couldn't. "Why did you leave?" I typed back, surprising myself with the sudden, vulnerable honesty. He responded almost instantly. "Because I wanted you to have space. But I can't stop thinking about you either." His words reached a place deep inside me, touching something I didn't fully understand. It was more than just intrigue, more than a simple curiosity about who he was. This connection felt real, powerful, like a secret language only we could understand. In his words, I felt seen in a way that had become unfamiliar, something I hadn't felt in a long time, not even in the warmth of my marriage, in the life I'd built with the man I loved. For a long moment, I just stared at his words, feeling the weight of the choices that lay before me. I could let him go, could end this strange, uncharted path I'd started down, returning to the stability, the safety of my marriage. But as much as I loved my husband, I knew that what I felt with this stranger was something I hadn't even realized I was missing. "Where are you now?" I typed, almost without thinking, each letter feeling heavier than the last. "I'm close by," he replied. "If you want, we could meet. No pressure. Just two people talking." My heart raced. I felt the pull of his words, the unmistakable thrill of crossing a line I'd always believed would be unthinkable. Part of me knew I should say no, should end this before it went any further. But the other part, the part that had kept me awake at night, wondering about him, longing for more, was stronger. "Where should I meet you?" I sent, my hands trembling as I hit send. He replied with an address, a little cafe on the edge of town, one I didn't even know existed. My heart pounded as I grabbed my coat, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts and emotions, each one louder than the last. I tried not to think, tried to ignore the nagging voice in my head reminding me of everything I had to lose. But in that moment, the desire to see him again, to finally bridge the gap between us, was stronger than anything else. When I arrived at the cafe, the street was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of the streetlights. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, and immediately saw him sitting in a corner booth, his face shadowed but unmistakable. His eyes met mine, and I felt the air between us crackle with the unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. I walked over slowly, feeling as though I were moving through a dream, each step bringing me closer to something I couldn't quite define. When I reached him, he stood, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Hello," he said softly, his voice just as I remembered, low and calming, yet with an edge that made my pulse quicken. "Hi," I managed, feeling my cheeks flush under his gaze. I slid into the booth opposite him, my hands fidgeting on the table, unsure of what to say, of where to begin. For a long moment, Neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy, charged with everything that had led us to this point. Finally, he leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. I wanted to see you again." I swallowed, my heart racing as I tried to find the words. "I shouldn't be here," I whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. "I have a family, a life. This is wrong," he finished for me, his eyes softening. "Maybe it is, but that doesn't mean it isn't real." I looked down, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. He was right, and that truth terrified me more than anything else. I'd been so sure that my life was complete, that I had everything I needed. But here, sitting across from this man I barely knew, I felt a part of myself awaken, a part that I hadn't known existed. "Why me?" I finally asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He smiled, a faint, almost sad smile. "Because I see you. I see the way you carry yourself, the strength you wear so well, even when you're hurting. I see the kindness in your eyes, the way you light up when you talk about something you love. I see the real you, not just the wife, not just the mother. And I can't look away." His words wrapped around me, pulling me deeper into the quiet intimacy that had settled between us. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but at the same time, I felt safe with him in a way I hadn't expected. For a moment, the weight of my life, my responsibilities, faded into the background, leaving only the two of us, suspended in the quiet magic of that moment. The night stretched on as we talked, each word pulling me further from the world I knew and deeper into a place I didn't want to leave. He told me about his life, his work, his passions, each story revealing pieces of him that resonated with parts of myself I had almost forgotten. Hours passed, and I felt as though I'd known him for years, as though he were a missing piece I'd been waiting to find. Eventually, the cafe grew quiet, and the staff began cleaning up, signaling the end of our time together. I felt a pang of sadness as he stood, reaching for his coat. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said gently, his gaze never leaving mine. "And I understand if you want to walk away. But I'll be here, waiting, if you ever want to see me again." He hesitated, as though debating whether to say more, before finally leaning in, his hand brushing against mine. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me, and my breath caught, a mixture of fear and anticipation swirling in my chest. But he pulled back, his expression softening. "Good night," he whispered, before turning and walking out the door, leaving me standing alone, my heart pounding, my mind reeling with everything that had happened. As I drove home, his words echoed in my mind, filling the silence with a quiet, aching longing I couldn't shake. I knew I had crossed a line, stepped into a world I wasn't sure I could leave. And yet, as I lay in bed that night, my husband's familiar warmth beside me, I knew that part of me was still at that cafe, lingering in the shadows with a man who saw me in ways I couldn't explain. Over the days that followed, I found myself returning to the memories of that night, replaying every word, every look, as though trying to hold onto something I knew was slipping away. I told myself it was over, that I'd made my choice, that my family came first. But each time my phone buzzed, a spark of hope ignited within me, a longing that refused to fade. And then, one night, as I stood alone in the kitchen, my phone lit up with a message. "I haven't stopped thinking about you. Meet me again." The words sent a thrill through me, a pulse of excitement and fear that I couldn't ignore. I knew the risks, knew the dangers of what I was doing. But in that moment, the pull of his words, the promise of something more, was stronger than anything else. And as I typed back a single word, yes, I knew that I was stepping further into a world I might never be able to leave. The next few days were a haze of anticipation and guilt, a strange blend that I'd never felt before. I spent hours overanalyzing everything, my messages with him, the way he looked at me in the cafe, the small gestures that spoke of his interest, his pull toward me. Yet as the time to meet him drew closer, another part of me was weighed down by doubt, by the sharp awareness of what I was risking. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when we'd arranged to meet. I told my husband I was going out to run errands, feeling the familiar pang of guilt as he kissed me goodbye, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I tried not to think too much about it, tried to ignore the voice in my head telling me to turn back, to end this. But the need to see him, to understand this connection between us, was stronger than any hesitation. He was waiting at the same little cafe. This time, he chose a table near the back, secluded, as though he wanted us to have our own world, away from prying eyes. When I walked in, he stood up, his eyes locking onto mine, and in that moment, every lingering doubt faded. "You came," he murmured, his voice filled with something that felt like relief. I nodded, unable to speak, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. I sat down, feeling the air between us thicken with the tension that had built over our weeks of quiet messages, of secret looks and words left unspoken. We ordered coffee, but the words I wanted to say caught in my throat. It was strange, feeling this way with someone I barely knew, a man who was both a stranger and somehow the most familiar presence I'd felt in years. Finally, he broke the silence. "I know this must be confusing for you," he said softly, his eyes filled with understanding. "It's confusing for me, too. But sometimes when you meet someone who sees you, really sees you, it's impossible to ignore." I felt my cheeks flush, his words piercing the heart of what had drawn me to him in the first place. He understood me, saw through my walls, reached into the hidden parts of myself I'd thought were buried forever. And as much as I wanted to deny it, the truth was undeniable. I hadn't felt this alive, this deeply understood, in a long, long time. "Why me?" I whispered, the question slipping out before I could stop it. His gaze softened, and for a moment, he looked vulnerable, his calm mask slipping. "Because I see something in you that's rare. A spark, a strength, and a quiet sadness. I see the way you take care of everyone around you, but keep pieces of yourself hidden. And I don't know why, but I can't stay away from it." His words stirred something deep within me, a hidden ache I couldn't name. I had always been the one holding things together, the strong one, the caretaker. Yet here was someone who saw the pieces I hid, the fragments I didn't dare show to anyone else. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my coffee. "I don't know what I'm doing here," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I have a family, a life. It's not who I am." "I know," he replied gently, his gaze never wavering. "And I'm not here to take anything away from you. I want you to know that you're not alone, that there's someone who understands." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was soft, almost hesitant, yet it sent a spark through me that left me breathless. I wanted to pull away, to break the contact, but I couldn't. His hand was warm, grounding me in a way that felt both comforting and electric. For a moment, we just sat there, our hands barely touching, the silence between us heavy with everything we couldn't say. And in that silence, I realized how deeply I'd missed this feeling, the excitement, the thrill, the sense of being truly seen. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. After a while, he spoke again, his voice soft and steady. "I don't want to make things harder for you. If this is too much, if it's hurting you, just say the word and I'll walk away. I care about you too much to see you torn." I looked down, my heart aching with the weight of his words. I knew he meant it, that he would walk away if I asked, but the thought of losing this connection, of going back to the life I'd known before, felt unbearable. It was a life I loved, a life I had chosen and built with care, yet here I was, drawn to something forbidden, something that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. "I don't want you to go," I whispered, barely recognizing my own voice. He exhaled, his eyes searching mine as though trying to understand the depth of my choice. For the first time, I allowed myself to let go of the guilt, to embrace the strange, intoxicating thrill of what was unfolding between us. I didn't know where this would lead, didn't know if I was making a mistake, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was the warmth of his hand on mine, the intensity of his gaze, the way he made me feel seen and cherished. Our meetings became a quiet, steady rhythm. each one drawing us closer, pulling us deeper into a world we'd created for ourselves, hidden from everyone else. We would meet in small cafes, in secluded parks, always careful, always aware of the line we were walking. And with each encounter, my feelings for him grew stronger, more complicated, mingling with the guilt and longing that filled my days. I began to notice how different I felt at home, how the weight of my marriage seemed both comforting and stifling at once. My husband was kind, steady, the man I'd built my life around, yet part of me felt a growing distance that I couldn't bridge. I knew it wasn't fair, knew I was the one creating this distance, yet I couldn't help myself. I was living two lives, each one pulling me in opposite directions, and the strain was becoming harder to bear. One night, after another stolen moment with him, I came home to find my husband waiting for me, his expression tense, his eyes filled with questions. My heart sank, dread pooling in my stomach as I realized he had noticed the change in me, had sensed the growing distance between us. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I forced a smile, my heart pounding as I nodded. "Of course. Just work has been stressful." He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze searching, and I felt a wave of guilt crash over me, guilt that threatened to drown the small thrill I'd been clinging to. Here was the man I'd chosen, the man who had loved and supported me through everything, yet I was hiding this secret, this other life, from him. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I felt the weight of my choices press down on me, suffocating, inescapable. I knew I couldn't go on like this, couldn't keep living in two worlds, torn between the life I'd built and the thrill of something forbidden. Yet the thought of letting go, of walking away from the man who had come to mean so much to me, felt impossible. The next morning, I found myself typing a message to him, my fingers trembling as I tried to find the words. "We need to talk." His response came quickly. "I'll be waiting." We met that afternoon, in a quiet park where we'd gone before, and as I saw him standing there, his expression filled with concern, I felt a pang of sadness, a deep ache that told me this was going to hurt more than I was prepared for. "I can't keep doing this," I whispered, my voice breaking as I spoke. "It's tearing me apart." He nodded, his gaze filled with understanding. "I know. And I don't want to make things harder for you. But I don't want to lose you either." The pain in his voice mirrored my own, and in that moment, I realized how deeply I had fallen, how much he had come to mean to me. But I also knew that I couldn't keep living in this limbo, couldn't keep betraying the man who had trusted me, who had given me everything. "I think we need to say goodbye," I whispered, my heart shattering with every word. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle, comforting. "If that's what you want, I'll respect it. But please know you've changed me. You've given me something I didn't think was possible." I looked into his eyes, seeing the same ache, the same longing that filled my own heart, and for a moment, I thought I might change my mind, that I might follow this path, no matter the cost. But the thought of hurting my family, of losing everything I'd built, was too much to bear. With one last, lingering look, I turned and walked away, my heart heavy, my mind filled with memories I would carry with me forever. In the days that followed, I tried to move on, tried to bury the ache, to focus on my family, my life, the things that truly mattered. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory of him lingered, a quiet shadow in the corners of my mind, a reminder of the life I'd almost chosen. And sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and my thoughts were my own, I would find myself reaching for my phone, hoping for a message that would never come. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, life began to settle back into its familiar rhythm. Yet there was a new kind of emptiness, a quiet ache that I carried with me, invisible to everyone around me. I threw myself into my routine, into the comfort of my family and home, hoping that the weight of my decision would lessen with time. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory of him remained, a persistent ghost haunting the edges of my thoughts. I kept expecting, maybe even hoping, to see his number appear on my phone again. I wanted to believe that he would respect my decision, that he would let me go, but a part of me longed for his words, for the way he made me feel. Each time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt, and each time it was a mundane message from a friend, a reminder for a dentist appointment, or a work email, my heart sank a little further. I told myself I was being foolish. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? To go back to my life, to keep my family intact, to avoid shattering the stable world I'd built. But now, in the quiet moments between the responsibilities of the day, I realized that I'd lost something precious. I had glimpsed a side of myself that I couldn't easily ignore, a part of me that craved excitement, passion, a sense of being seen and understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. Then one evening, months after our last meeting, something unexpected happened. My husband and I were cleaning up after dinner, chatting about the kids and our plans for the weekend, when he paused, setting down a dish and looking at me with an intensity one hadn't seen in a long time. "Is everything okay with us?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with a weight that made my stomach twist. My hands froze over the sink, my heart pounding as I forced myself to meet his gaze. I hadn't realized how much my distraction had affected him, how the quiet distance between us had grown without either of us acknowledging it. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "Why wouldn't it be?" He watched me, his eyes searching, and I could see the uncertainty, the hurt, even if he was trying to hide it. "I don't know, you've just seemed different lately. Distant, maybe. I keep wondering if there's something I've missed." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a surge of guilt that was almost overwhelming. Here was the man who had stood by me through everything, who had given me a life, a family, and yet I had betrayed him in ways he couldn't even imagine. He had sensed my distraction, the quiet emotional distance that had grown between us, and even now, he was reaching out, trying to bridge the gap. I took a shaky breath, the weight of my secrets pressing down on me. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess, to unburden myself of the quiet shame I carried, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I simply reached out, taking his hand in mine. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I've just been overwhelmed, I guess. With work, with life. It's nothing to do with us." He squeezed my hand, his gaze softening as he pulled me into his arms. "I love you, you know that? We're a team. If something's wrong, we'll get through it together." I nodded, burying my face in his shoulder, feeling both comforted and devastated. I knew he meant it, knew that he loved me more than anything. And yet, in that moment, all I could feel was the gulf between us, the distance that my heart had created, even as he held me close. After that night, I made a conscious effort to focus on my marriage, to pour my energy into reconnecting with my husband. I planned little dates for us, arranged for the kids to stay with my mother so we could have some time alone. Even surprised him with a weekend getaway. For a while, it seemed to work. We laughed more, talked late into the night like we used to, and I felt the warmth of our bond slowly rekindling. I wanted to believe that this was enough, that I could build a life without the shadows of regret and longing that lingered in my heart. But late at night, when the house was silent and my husband lay sleeping beside me, the memories of him returned, unbidden and relentless. I would find myself lying awake, replaying every moment of our encounters, every word and glance, every touch. It was as though he had imprinted himself on my heart, a presence I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. In those quiet hours, I would scroll through my messages, lingering on the old threads, the ones I had deleted but could still remember, word for word. Months passed, and though I threw myself into my life, into my marriage, the ache remained, a quiet reminder of the part of myself I'd left behind. Then, one evening, as I sat alone in the living room, sipping a glass of wine after a long day, my phone buzzed. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced at the screen, my breath catching when I saw an unfamiliar number. The message was simple, but it sent a shiver through me. "I've missed you." My mind raced, a whirlwind of emotions flooding me as I read and reread the words, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But there it was in black and white, undeniable. It was him. After all this time, He had reached out, shattering the carefully constructed life I'd built in his absence. I knew I shouldn't reply. I knew that opening this door again would lead me down a path I'd fought so hard to leave behind. But my fingers moved almost on their own, typing out a reply before I could stop myself. Why now? His response was almost immediate. Because I couldn't stay away anymore. The familiar thrill returned, mingling with a fear I couldn't ignore. I knew that this was dangerous, that I was playing with fire, but the pull was irresistible. He was my secret, my escape, the part of myself I'd hidden from everyone, even from myself. Over the next few days, our messages picked up again, slowly at first, cautious, as though we were both testing the waters, feeling the familiar connection reignite. He was as charming, as attentive, as he had always been, and I found myself drawn back into the web we'd spun months ago, unable to resist the quiet thrill of his words. Eventually, he suggested meeting, and despite every warning bell in my mind, I agreed. We chose a small, out-of-the-way restaurant, one where we wouldn't be recognized, where we could exist in our own little world, away from the prying eyes of reality. When I walked in and saw him sitting there, a rush of emotions overwhelmed me. He looked the same, yet there was something different in his expression, a depth, a quiet longing that mirrored my own. We talked for hours, our words flowing freely, the connection between us stronger than ever. I could feel myself falling, slipping back into the quiet intensity we shared, knowing full well the risks, the dangers, and yet powerless to stop it. After dinner, we walked outside, the city lights casting a soft glow over us as we stood in the quiet, empty street. He reached for my hand, his touch familiar and electrifying, and for a moment, I allowed myself to let go, to exist in this stolen moment, free from the weight of my choices. But as he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, a pang of guilt cut through the haze. I pulled back, my heart pounding, a rush of emotions crashing over me as I realized the depth of the line I was crossing. I can't, I whispered, my voice breaking as I stepped back. I thought I could, but I can't. He watched me, his expression filled with a quiet pain that mirrored my own. I understand, he murmured, his voice soft and steady. But please know, I'll always be here. Whatever happens, you're not alone. I nodded, unable to speak, feeling the ache of his words settle deep within me. With one last look, I turned and walked away, my heart heavy, the memory of him imprinted on my soul. I knew that this was the end, that I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what might have been, torn between two worlds. As I drove home that night, tears blurred my vision, and I knew that I would carry this secret with me, a quiet, bittersweet memory that would stay with me forever. I had chosen my life, my family, and I knew that was the right choice. But in the quiet moments, in the depths of my heart, I would always remember the man who had seen me, who had understood me in ways I hadn't known were possible. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. In the days that followed, I tried to throw myself fully back into my life. I buried myself in the comforting routine of family dinners, school drop-offs, and weekend outings. I poured all my energy into my marriage, determined to bridge the gap that had formed, even if it meant forcing a smile through the bittersweet ache that lingered in my heart. I wanted to be present, to give my husband and children the version of me they deserved, the one who didn't carry the weight of a hidden, forbidden connection. But the memory of him haunted me, slipping into my thoughts when I least expected it. I'd find myself folding laundry and suddenly feel the weight of his gaze, the memory of his hand brushing against mine. Or I'd be sitting beside my husband on the couch, his arm around me, and in the quiet moments, I'd catch myself wondering what he was doing, where he was, if he missed me as much as I missed him. The guilt washed over me in waves, filling me with shame and regret for things I hadn't even allowed myself to do. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table after the kids had gone to bed, my husband joined me, his expression thoughtful, a quiet seriousness in his eyes. I could feel the weight of his gaze, knew he'd sensed the restlessness in me, the way I seemed present but miles away at the same time. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. Of course I was happy. I had a beautiful life, a loving family, a marriage that many would envy. But the words felt hollow, incomplete, because I knew there was a part of me that had been stirred awake, a part that yearned for something more, something that I couldn't name. Yes, I replied, forcing a smile. Of course I am. But he didn't look convinced. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle, comforting, and yet it only heightened the ache within me. I feel like I've lost you somehow, he said, his voice tinged with vulnerability. I don't know where you went, but it feels like you're not here with me, not really. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I tried to blink them back, unwilling to let him see the cracks forming in the facade I'd so carefully built. He was right. He could sense the change in me, the quiet distance I couldn't bridge, no matter how hard I tried. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess, to unburden myself of the secret I'd been carrying. But the words wouldn't come. I was too afraid of the damage it would do, too afraid of what it would mean for the life we'd built together. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice breaking. I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know. Like I'm lost. He squeezed my hand, his gaze filled with a compassion that only deepened my guilt. We'll find a way back, he said softly. Together. Whatever it is, we'll get through it. I nodded, forcing a smile, but deep down, I knew that it wasn't that simple. This wasn't something that could be fixed with time, or love, or even understanding. It was a part of myself that had awakened, a longing that I couldn't silence, no matter how much I wanted to. And in that moment, I realized that this was my burden to carry, a secret that would stay with me, hidden in the quiet corners of my heart. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, I began to accept the quiet ache that had become a part of me. I learned to live with it, to carry it like a hidden scar, a reminder of the man who had touched my life in ways I hadn't expected. I kept waiting for the pain to fade, for the memory of him to soften, but it lingered, a constant presence that I couldn't shake. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out a drawer in my bedroom, I stumbled upon an old, forgotten notebook. Flipping through the pages, I found myself scribbling down the words that had been bottled up inside me for so long. I wrote about the way he'd made me feel, the way he'd seen me, the quiet intensity of our connection, the way it had filled me with both joy and sorrow. I poured everything onto the pages, as though by writing it down, I could somehow release the weight of it, give myself a sense of closure. But instead, the words seemed to deepen the ache, to bring his memory to life in a way that was almost painful. I found myself revisiting the notebook in the quiet hours, adding more thoughts, more memories, more fragments of the life we'd almost shared. It became my secret refuge, a place where I could express the feelings I couldn't share with anyone else, not even my husband. The notebook became a silent witness to my hidden heart, a place where I could preserve the parts of myself that I'd buried, the pieces that belonged to him, to the version of myself I'd discovered in his presence. And as the weeks passed, I found solace in those pages, a quiet peace that I hadn't known I needed. Then, one night, something happened that would change everything. I was sitting alone in the living room, lost in my thoughts, when my husband walked in, holding the notebook in his hands. My heart stopped, dread pooling in my stomach as I realized what he was holding, the secrets he now held in his hands. I found this, he said quietly, his voice steady, though I could see the pain, the confusion in his eyes. He set the notebook down on the coffee table, his gaze never leaving mine. I didn't mean to invade your privacy, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to know what was going on with you. I felt a rush of panic, shame, 1,000 emotions crashing over me as I stared at the notebook, the pages filled with words I'd never intended for anyone else to read. I wanted to run, to hide, to take it all back, but it was too late. The truth was out, exposed, and there was no escaping the consequences. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice trembling. I never meant for you to find out. I didn't want to hurt you. He sat down across from me, his gaze filled with a mixture of hurt and compassion. Is it true? Everything you wrote? I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Yes. But it's over now. It ended months ago. I didn't do anything. I never crossed that line. He was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but laced with pain. I believe you. But the fact that you felt this way, that you were able to connect with someone like this, I don't know what to do with that. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, my heart breaking as I realized the depth of the pain I'd caused. I had hurt him in a way that I couldn't undo, and the weight of that realization was almost unbearable. I never stopped loving you, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. But there was a part of me that I lost, a part that I didn't even know was missing until I met him. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. But it was wrong, and I know that now. I chose you. I chose us. He nodded, his gaze softening, though the hurt remained. I know you did. And I'm grateful for that. But it's going to take time. Trust doesn't just come back overnight. I reached for his hand, hoping to convey the depth of my regret, my love, everything I couldn't put into words. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, I whispered. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our family. He squeezed my hand, his gaze filled with a quiet strength that both comforted and humbled me. We'll get through this, he said softly. It won't be easy, and there will be days when it feels impossible. But I'm willing to try. For us. For our family. In that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile light in the darkness that had consumed me. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the wounds I'd caused would take time to heal, but I was ready to face it. I was ready to fight for my marriage, to rebuild the trust I'd broken, to find a way back to the life we'd once shared. As we sat there, holding hands in the quiet of our living room, I realized that this was my second chance, a chance to find healing, to let go of the past, to embrace the life I'd almost lost. And as painful as it was, I knew that I was ready to take that step, to move forward, to create a new chapter in the story of our lives. Because in the end, love wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience, about forgiveness, about finding a way to stay when leaving felt easier. And as we sat together, bound by the pain and the love that had brought us here, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be.